Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me for another Iconic Comics review. And we are today taking a look at Soulfinder, Tunnel Hounds. This is a very interesting book. And I know that whenever I review one of these books by Doug Ernst and Matt Weldon, I spend a lot of time talking about all the things I like. And that's really not going to be too different this time around. I think this time, because we're playing more in a historical realm, I have a few more things to say about that, things I would have liked to see. But on the whole, especially if you're not a big history nerd, and I can be a bit of a big history nerd, there is enough here to go on that you'll be okay. So, as usual, I'm gonna do my full review process here. But even before we get to the spoiler section, let me just say that this book is one I highly recommend reading, knowing as little about it as possible. Because one thing I talk about a lot when I talk about these long running series is how good they are as a jumping on point. And Soulfinder Tunnel Hounds is an excellent jumping on point. This was something that I think Infinite Ascent didn't have as much. I think really more so than some of the other iconic comic lines like Common America especially, or even Black Ops. You can jump into any issue of Soulfinder and do pretty well. But this one in particular, I think, is a great introduction to the franchise and to one of the characters that I think is harder to get a read on. And if you're familiar with this franchise, this book is the backstory of Father Crane. We don't actually see Father Redder or Detective Chua in here at all, which is fine. Crane was not in Infinite Ascent very much, so we're kind of getting this balancing act between the cast. But on the whole, I think if you're looking for a story that just gives you a flavor for the world, this is a very good book for it. And it's also interesting because this is also a war story where most of the Soulfinder adventures are modern day exorcisms or kind of Black Ops operation kind of things. We've had a little bit of both, depending on whether we're looking at Black Tide or Demon's Match or Infinite Ascent or even Warcry. Each of those, they have different levels of balance between those two aspects, but they are really more thriller spy stories or kind of straightforward investigative horror stories with a little bit of spiritual warfare at the end in the case of Demon's Match and Warcry. So this is an actual war story, and it has a very different flavor. So I think it stands on its own very well. And other than to say that it revolves around tunnel hounds, which are soldiers in Vietnam who specialized in clearing the underground tunnels the Viet Cong would dig, I don't think you really need a whole lot of context of the larger Soulfinder world. And, I kind of, when I get a book like this, I kind of wish I could go and look at it with fresh eyes and be like, what is it like if this is my first exposure to a franchise? But yeah, all in all, I think this book would be really cool to look at from that point of view. So let's talk about the book on the whole. This is a perfect bound book. I'm sure there's a hardcover cover coming, but I wanted to read this ASAP and let you know what I thought of it. And obviously, I think it's quite good. Physically, the book is of your standard iconic quality. This perfect binding is going to hold up pretty well. You probably got a dozen reads in this before it starts to show serious wear and tear. So if you're the kind of person that just reads a book once or twice, this is going to do very well, and then you can maybe share it with someone else, or you can put it on your shelf. It'll look real nice there. The paper stock is the usual. It's got a nice low gloss kind of a satin finish. Something I noticed here that I don't know if I've noticed it in other iconic books or not. I guess I could have gone and checked, but I didn't do that. Uh, it seems a little rougher than the paper that comes in some of their previous books, and I don't know if their printing company changed stock or if this is something they're just doing for these soft covers. It's not bad, but if you really like that slick paper feel as you're reading your book, you're not going to find it here. Just something to think about. I don't know if anyone besides myself really obsesses over those kind of details as they're reading a book, but it was something that stood out to me. And if you're coming here for my thoughts, I figure it's the kind of thing you might like to know. The art is by Matthew Weldon, and Matt Weldon is a phenomenal artist. He's been very good. He continues to be very good. There are some things I've noticed in here that are, I think, overall improvements in his style. One of the things I really noticed is that there is, I believe he's Vietnamese. There is this Soul Finder priest here, and he does these ecclesiastical gestures a lot of time while he's in combat. And the way he holds his hands is very expressive. In the past, I have found Weldon's art style to be a little bit stiff. He's very good at getting a pose, but he doesn't give it a lot of sense of motion sometimes. And especially in these exorcist scenes where we see the Soul Finder at work, I feel like he's really starting to get a handle on that. Not that he didn't have. Again, the posing is very good, and I noticed, especially in what I've read of Punchline, he can give a good sense of impact and weight, but movement and kinetics was sometimes a little bit lacking. And in these scenes, I get a much stronger feel of that as the guy's hands move, as we see the energy crackling around them in the spiritual warfare, as we see these bugs kind of like dropping out of nowhere or springing up out of the ground. These elements, they seem to come off the page and be a little more alive than they have been in the past. And that's very important for this kind of a story. So I think that while Matt's art has always been beautiful to look at, and it has always done a good job of telling the story, there is kind of an intangible aspect to it that I sometimes felt was lacking when I first read early Punchline stuff that has been slowly creeping in more and more. And I'm getting more of that sense of a living, breathing world behind the image rather than just an excellent illustration. And I like to see that. Story-wise, this all takes place in Vietnam. I don't want to call this a flashback because that would imply there's some kind of framing device where we see Crane and Redder, or maybe Crane and Blatty, Father Blatty, in the present day, and that doesn't happen. What does happen is we get the story of a kid from Texas who goes to war in Vietnam and goes from someone who counts on his parents for everything. That I think that juveniles, excuse me. I think that makes Crane sound too juvenile. Let's put it that way. He was clearly a person who thought in terms of his family. He related everything back to his parents when he was younger. And he goes away to war, and all of a sudden, he doesn't have his parents as a touchstone anymore. And he has to learn to be a man himself. And that is a very fascinating story. And along with it, we get the sense that Crane, I mean, it's explicitly said Crane was not a believer. And we know that Crane is going to be a soul finder himself in the future. At least if we've read the rest of the series. Again, I am really curious how this story reads to someone who doesn't know that. But we know that Crane is going to go through this spiritual awakening in the story, and it is interesting to see all the elements that go into that. We get a sense for Crane pretty quickly, because we open with this shot of him doing his job. It's really it's really effective at conveying what Crane does, because the first page we see is him and Captain Blatty, later Father Blatty, crouched down in this tunnel in Vietnam, and it's so immediate and visceral. We are right there, and a grenade comes down into the tunnel, and right away we know what the stakes are and what kind of a person Crane is, because he moves very quickly to respond to this threat, and then Captain Blatty saves his life. And then we get this flashback, just 2 pages, where he's saying goodbye to his parents at the Crane's car repair shop. I think it's a repair shop. Maybe it's a gas station. Maybe it's both. Back then, it was kind of everything in one place. And, he's saying goodbye. His dad promises not to drive the car again until he comes home. And he gives the key to Crane. And Crane actually has that key on him for most of the story. We see him looking at it at times. A very good piece of visual storytelling there. Whenever he's looking at that key, he's thinking of home. Then we go back to Vietnam. We learn a lot about Crane's investment in his men. And we're introduced to the Soul Finder. I don't think we ever get the number on this Soul Finder. And I don't think we get a name either. I believe it's typical for Soul Finders when they're working to identify themselves by their number. So that was a little bit strange. I am curious if this is Soul Finder 76, I believe, or 75, Crane's immediate predecessor, or if he's maybe a couple of numbers back. It's not really that important. My OCD kind of likes to know whether the numbers are lining up, immediately, or whether there's a gap there. Of course, we know there's a gap between Crane and Redder, and that's, an interesting question in and of itself. So the part of me that's looking for those story thread connections really invested in knowing what the number is. And it may have been said somewhere, and I just missed it. But I'm pretty sure it's not mentioned. And that would be a very deliberate choice on Doug's part. I know he tends to put those elements in or leave them out with a lot of intentionality. Maybe he just forgot. Maybe it was in there and then it got taken out during an editing pass and not put back in somewhere else. It could be. It could be a deliberate choice. My curiosity is piqued. Anyways, it turns out that a demon is working in conjunction with some of the North Vietnamese and some of the Americans, because, demons, they don't pledge allegiance to any flag or nation. Evil is everywhere. And they're doing something in this particular part of Vietnam. And the Soul Finder has been sent to deal with it, and the Tunnel Hounds have to help him do his job. All in all, pretty straightforward story. I mean, honestly, most of the Soul Finder stories have been pretty straightforward, and that is a strength of them. It gives us a lot of time to look at the kinds of trials the demons are using to tempt people, to test people. It gives us a lot of opportunities for good character moments. And there is clearly a meta plot. There is an idea. Blackfire is the demon in play in this particular story, and that's a name we've heard before. So the machinations of these demons, demons are immortal, and they are not going to be out of humanity's hair until the final judgment. So, of course, we are going to see them a lot. And maybe they are not always playing the exact same game, but they are, working at very big projects, and we see them being thwarted by, people who are serving as God's messengers time and time again. Very interesting, and it's very clear that's what's going on with this book, because this, again, is a different Soul Finder in a different era, doing much the same thing we see in the other 3 books. So that creates kind of this sense of continuity. The time has changed, the people have changed, but the nature of spiritual warfare and the importance of dealing with these threats remains a constant. And that's very neat to see as well. That's actually something that I think a lot of of superhero stories with their focus on just the one character, whether it's Superman or Batman or whatever. You almost always have the same character doing the same things, and there's no sense of the way the times change, but the great battle remains the same, because you always have the same person at the center of it. But by seeing all these different Soul Finders in play, we can get a sense that, yes, things are changing and there's, some progression, but the core of the battle remains the same. The manifestation of the demon in this case is scorpions, and that was very interesting. So we've had kind of like an octopus sea creature kind of a thing. We've had a snake. Actually, there's a snake in this one as well, and I wonder if that's a sign that the demon we saw in Demon's Match is also present during this conflict in Vietnam. So yeah, there was the spider guy in Infinite Ascent. So each demon manifestation, even if it's kind of a similar demon at the core, can manifest in different ways. So that's very creepy. There's just a lot of good stuff in here. But what's really impressive is the blending of these elements with the war story. Because there's a lot of regular mundane fighting in here as well. And there's actually some of the best panel work, I think, is in these sections. And this is one of those things where I'm not sure if it was the writer or the artist who came up with an idea, but there is this section where Crane and Blatty and the Soul Finder and another character who's known as Hush Puppy, or later just Hush, because he's not the new guy in the unit anymore, are crawling through this tunnel. And just look at the way it's laid out. This is so claustrophobic. All these tiny, narrow panels, and you can really feel the way the characters are squeezed up against the roof because they're kind of breaking out of these panels from page to page. And then things kind of spread out a bit more over here as they come into a more open area. It's really great visual storytelling. I wonder, was this an idea Doug had and he wrote into the script? Or was it an idea that Matt pitched to Doug as he was reading the script and starting to thumbnail and lay out his ideas for how to tell the story? These things are really interesting to me. And I've interviewed Doug before. At some point, I may try and ask him about that in person. Or maybe he'll just let me know down in the comments, because sometimes he does comment. But things like that, they show that they make this story unique, because this is the kind of paneling you could only do in this story. That's very exciting, and it's a good function of what this is as a war story, because this is the combat environment these characters are in, and it's well applied to the story to build tension and the sense of claustrophobia, and to set up, the inevitable confrontation between them and Blackfire. That said, this is a war story, and it seems to be tied back to some specific historical events. There's a village that gets hit by an airstrike. F-4 Phantoms are called in. They wipe it out. We're told this is a war crime, and Crane eventually winds up leaving the military because of it, from the sound of things. And I'm not familiar with this particular incident. The Vietnam War, not something I've read up a lot on. And I know Doug did a lot of reading while he was getting ready for this story. I would have appreciated maybe, because, Doug has his author's notes here at the end. And I think if you are going to tie a story into historical events in this way, maybe having a page that gives a brief summary of those historical events and maybe some places to go for more reading would have been appreciated. It's a very minor nitpick, but it is something that I think, again, especially for me, because I tend to be a bit of a history nut, something I really appreciate when there is such a close touchstone to an actual historical event in a story. Just a thought. Would have been nice to have. So, all in all, one other thing. There is something I'm a sucker for in here, at least hinted at, and that's an underground civilization. There's a hint that there may have been some kind of, um, you know, maybe something like a Gobekli Tepe, I think is how you say it. One of these underground cities somewhere in Vietnam. And I don't know if that's something Doug made up, if it's something there were legends about among soldiers in Vietnam, and he was kind of alluding to that being true in the iconic comic universe, or if it was just something he threw in to be fun. That would have been nice to know as well. Because if there are actual legends like that, I would love to read them. And yeah, that is this kind of thing that always perks my interest. I find underground civilizations and Hollow Earth fascinating. Not that I necessarily think they're real, but it's very fun for me to look at those and see what the ideas were and in what direction they went. So that would have been nice to have some kind of signpost for, at least. But all in all, those are small nitpicks, and I don't know if anyone who doesn't have my unique hang-ups and tastes in storytelling would have found any of that significant. All in all, this is a great story. We get a really fascinating look into the early life of Father Crane. We get a sense of what leads him to a more applicable faith. There's some signs in here that maybe his family was religious, but he was not. At one point, when they're fighting Blackfire, there was a scapula, which is something you wear around your neck that is briefly protecting Crane, and then Blackfire says it was from the woman, and we don't really get a whole lot of information about that, but I think it's kind of a hint that Crane's mother sent him something to help keep him safe on the battlefield. So that's an interesting tidbit there. But really, this is the moment where Crane has to decide what he believes on his own, and it's a fascinating story. It's not a pat story. There is a soul finder on the scene to do most of the heavy lifting here. But he does kind of empower the soldiers, Blatty, Crane, and Hush Puppy, with some weapons to hold their own. But this kind of spiritual warfare, you can't just borrow the power of others. And we see that Crane kind of has to come to grips with the fact that he is not ready for this kind of enemy. And for someone who has such a strong sense of responsibility, it's very easy to draw the line from that lesson to him becoming a priest and a soul finder. The notion that this is what he has to do to continue to fulfill his duties after this is very easy to see from the way Crane is depicted in this book and the way we see him in some of the other soul finder books. It's a very good bit of character building. It's great writing. And we also get to learn a little bit about Father Blatty, who, turns up as the priest in Carly Vander's parish in the Common America books, which was interesting. It's always kind of been alluded to the fact that they have a connection from Vietnam. I wasn't expecting to see as much of Blatty as I did in this book, because he was just sort of the leader of Crane's unit and a tunnel hound himself. Very, very interesting stuff. Very fun to read. Comes with a strong recommend. And normally I would probably do a little more spoiler talk and dig deeper into some of the more spoilerish plot elements, but I don't think it's necessary. There's not a whole lot to comment on other than to say I really liked the final reveals of the villain. I thought the body horror transformations were pretty cool. I thought the warfare in the spiritual realm was very cool. It followed, a lot of the established Soul Finder rules. Obviously, whatever Soul Finder was working with Crane in this book is just on a different level. We haven't seen Red or Crane do anything remotely like that in any of their encounters with demons. I don't know if that's because it's not necessary or they just didn't have the faith of this particular soul finder. But it was very cool to see that this is soul finders can operate on levels way above and beyond what we have actually seen them do up until this point. And that's really all I have to say. It's fun, it's engaging. It does a lot of character building work. And I think I've said before that it looks to me like Doug is kind of alternating between these kind of high action, almost thriller-esque stories and these slightly slower, more personal stories that really build the character a lot. And even though Soulfinder Tunnel Hounds is a war story, war tends to be a little bit slower than a lot of people give it credit for. There's a lot of sitting around and waiting. There's a lot of grunt work, and the terrifying moments of high stress are few and far between, even though they stand out very strongly to anyone who's experienced it. And this book is a lot like that. There's a lot of downtime in this book, for lack of a better way to put it. And we get to see a lot of what makes Father Crane tick. He's very intellectual. I guess he's Sergeant Crane in this book. So we see a lot of what makes Sergeant Crane tick. They call him Professor because he likes to read books. He's very thoughtful and methodical. He has this strong sense of responsibility, and we get a really strong sense of all of these elements of this person and some of the people he's working with. Father Blatty or I guess Captain Blatty, is shown as this very kind of easygoing, very flexible person who knows how to handle other people. Exactly what you might expect of, an officer who has to balance the demands of the general staff and his units. It's very easy to see how he's going to grow into the older man with a very laissez-faire almost outlook on life that we know in the Common America books. So there's a lot of great character work in this book, but it also serves as a great introduction to the world. And I'm really glad to see a book like this come out because, as I said, it's a jumping on point. People, Demon's Match, the introduction to the Soulfinder universe, is a fine book. And it introduces us to a very modern character that you can read his story, you can get a sense for what's going on. But the stakes are different, and the dynamics of the characters are different, and the environment, again, it's modern day. And that doesn't necessarily appeal to everyone. So if you have people who want a little more of that high adventure, a little more of that exotic locale, and a little bit more of that brothers in arms kind of attitude in their storytelling, you can give them Tunnel Hounds, and they will have a good introduction to the idea of the Soul Finders and an environment that is going to be more appealing to their likes and dislikes in storytelling. And then hopefully they'll get hooked and they'll go back and read Demon's Match and Black Tide and Infinite Ascent. All in all, I really enjoyed this. It's very clear that Doug has a sense of his basic structure for a Soul Finder series, and he is flexing it around to get the exact balance of character and story and world building that he wants in any particular installment. And I think Tunnel Hounds is a great example of the diversity of stories that he can tell within that framework. Do I like it as much as Infinite Ascent? No, but that's because Detective Chu is my boy, and he's not in this book. And it is interesting that I felt like some of the basic character dynamics were lacking because 2 of the 3 core characters are missing from the story. But it still does a really great job of telling a fun and engaging story. I just felt like Blatty and Crane were the two who I was most in touch with in this book because they are the characters I already know. And I also have a sense that the Soul Finder we saw here and Hush Puppy probably not going to come back around in a big way later on. Now you never know. You never know for sure. And we certainly could see either of those characters again. But yeah, I think that subjectively, for someone who's already very invested in the series, while it was really fun to see Crane at this stage in his life, I didn't feel as invested in some of the other characters just because I'm like, well, these are our guest stars, and they're very good guest stars, but they are not the meat and potatoes of the series. And I do look forward to seeing Father Redder and Detective Chua come back in the next installment. In the meantime, do check out Tunnel Hounds. Really fun, really engaging story, letting us see the Soul Finders working in a completely different context from what we've seen so far. And yeah, if you're looking for an opportunity to get into a new Iconic Comics franchise, this is a great way to do it. If you've been enjoying Soul Finder already, you're going to find everything you loved in those books in this book, except for Father Redder and Detective Chua, because, I don't think they were born yet. Just saying. Again, congratulations to Doug and Matt. You've put out another excellent book that I really enjoyed, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next. Let me know what you thought of Soul Finder Tunnel Hounds down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I'll talk to you later.